firstly to introduce myself. I'm Owen Greene at Bradford University, based here. I'm in the Department of Peace Studies, the sister or partner organisation to BCID, Division for Development Studies, where I am linked with the Africa Centre, but also direct a sister centre, the Centre for International Cooperation and Security within Peace Studies. So it's a pleasure to introduce our four presenters for three papers. So one will be a double act, and we'll take it in the order it's on the programme. And just as before, we'll take each paper in turn and then open it up for a wider discussion at the end. So as you can see, the panel doesn't have a strict title, but it all relates to different aspects of community level development, it seems to me, and some of the challenges and developments there. So without further introduction, let me introduce Dan Brockington from Manchester University.
First of all, thank you very much indeed to the organisers of the conference for this invitation. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to take part, and I've learned a great deal and met some people who I should have met many years ago. And thank you too for the amazing technical support. This laptop here is connected to the screen using an extraordinary device featured here, which I've never come across before. I think in Tanzania it has a technical term. I think we would call it uchawi. It has also the property of rendering any data presented through this computer to be completely true. So please do not be sceptical of this work. We were introduced yesterday to a conundrum, a difference of opinion between Andrew at the back, Andrew Coulson, who was saying that GDP growth is not likely to benefit rural poverty and change rural poverty very much. And Brian at the front here was suggesting that there has been some form of social revolution in the rural areas, which is centred around the selling of food crops. I'm going to present the hypothesis today that Brian is right. My sample size is derisory. It is in all sorts of ways inadequate, but nonetheless it sustains the hypothesis that there may have been that social revolution in some parts of the country. To do that, I will demonstrate the arguments for and against, and particularly show why Andrew's opinion is a very credible one. I will then show trends which indicate something else might be going on. I will be offering some explanations of that change if it has occurred, and then, and this is important, I'll be talking about how to scale up this research. Now this will involve money, but it will involve giving other people money. This money already exists, so please listen carefully when we come to this part of the presentation. You will want to listen to that bit. These are then the reasons why Andrew is suggesting that GDP growth does not benefit the rural poor. We have on the top line growth in GDP from 1991 to 2007, a 33% increase in the last decade of the millennium, a 54% increase in the first 7 years of this millennium, resulting in derisory decreases in basic needs poverty and food poverty. GDP growth, according to this measure, is simply not reaching the income of the poor. But, and here's the rub, these changes come from the Household Budget Survey. Now, Household Budget Survey measures monthly expenditures in basic forms of income, particularly food and other basic needs. It does not, and it is quite explicit in the guidance here, it does not measure change in assets. It doesn't measure investment in education. It doesn't measure investment in houses. It is looking at everyday expenditure. And we know that if you're looking at poverty dynamics, change in assets is very important. I learnt this from a woman called Lucy Scott, who did her research, her PhD research in Bangladesh, monitoring wealth dynamics and finding that where people were getting wealthier in terms of their houses and their education, their livestock, she found no change in diet. I mean, it makes sense. As your income begins to increase, you don't suddenly start eating extraordinary foods. You put that improved livelihood into things which will lead a longer-term return. Now, Mashindano and others know this is the case. In fact, Lucy Scott is one of the authors of that paper, and throughout their book, they are saying assets matter. The difficulty is that, according to the measures they have, assets aren't included in these data. Now, last academic year I was on sabbatical in Tanzania in Hanang region, which is there. If you can't see red, it's that bit there. And I was underneath Mount Hanang, this rather lovely green splodge which you can't see for the lights. But I was based on the southeastern side in a village called Miaskron. And I read, while I was there, the work of Wesemate Lewiski, his PhD thesis that he wrote in 1995, of the neighbouring village of Gitting, located there. Gitting is now split into two villages, Gitting and Gotcho. I'm just going to call it Gitting for the sake of simplicity in this presentation. Now, Wesemate's work is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, he has a wealth categorisation of that village conducted in the 1990s that is centred upon assets. He came up with 7 categories of wealth in this area. The bottom two, the poor and the extremely poor, are people who, they may have land, but they are unable to work it. They cannot turn that asset into productive use. The best they can do is rent it out to people, often for long periods of time. They depend upon, in category 6, casual vibarua work. They are day-to-day labourers. But they are not able really to turn their assets into any form of livelihood. Categories 4 and 5 will merge into each other. They blur. And these are people who are in category 5 as self-sufficient farmers. They don't really employ vibarua, casual labourers, but they will have a few cattle and things like that. Those above them in category 4 are wealthy enough to employ every now and again people to do day-to-day labouring tasks. The rich and extremely rich are those with a great many assets, with great many labourers working for them, and they are found in this village partly because towards the end of the colonial period, this was one of the villages where the British tried to cultivate a yeomanry and invested a large amount of time and also bequeathed these people tractors and various other resources. And before villagisation, they were farming hundreds of acres of land and had the resources and the technical means to do so. So here is a classification of wealth based on assets. The second reason why this was a very interesting study was because of the distribution of population that Wesemate found in the early 1990s. And that you can see here. And the key point is that 55% of the population, more than that, 58% of the population were poor or extremely poor. The greatest single category of people belonged to the very poor, the destitute, those who could not even earn their own living. And this astonished me, because working in the village around the corner, a short bike ride away, I could not recognise the description of that village. And here I was in a neighbouring place which should have a very similar economy. And I wondered where the poor had gone. And the first hypothesis, Wesemate's work was flawed. Well, no. He got 18 different people to go through the ranking of the village households and produce the wealth ranking that we saw before us, and visited 100 of those households, just under 100 of those households himself personally to prove it. So I think the methods are reasonably accurate. Second, they've left. They've sold out their assets and gone, migrated to the towns. The third possibility, which I did not think was likely to be the case, is that they've got richer. I was very fortunate. I was able to get in touch with Wesemate and discovered he was in fact coming to Babati, the neighbouring town, in a few months' time. Great stroke of fortune, and when we met, we realised that this would be an interesting study to follow up. He found his household lists of the people he'd been to see. So I was able to revisit the households that he had surveyed in the early 1990s. And I was also able to reconduct the wealth ranking of the villages where he had worked. And what we found, and this is what we saw in the 1990s, the 58% of people who are very poor, was that in 2013, the distribution had changed. Now, the majority of households, 85% of the households are in the average category. Does this mean that the poor have become very rich? Well, not necessarily, because they could have moved out nonetheless, and those people who left could have become richer. We need to go back to the original households to see what happened. So, on this table you can see the original distribution of households in the 1990s. You've got 19 households you can see there in wealth group 7. That's the poorest, that's the most destitute. What happened to those 19 households? Well, 3 of them stayed the same. Another 3 moved up to become casual labourers, and the other 13, sorry, I'm rather bad at maths, became considerably richer. And the same is true For category 6, only one of them stayed the same. All the others became substantially richer. In category 5, you have just one household becoming poorer. Two of them are becoming a little bit richer in category 3. Category 4 and category 5 are a bit close, so it's a bit difficult to say that there is significant change here, but there is a clear upward trend. In category 4, again, category 4 and 5 being very close, this suggests an upward trend, but you've still got a little bit of impoverishment. What do you think happened to categories 2 and 3, the rich groups? What happened to them? Say that again?
They left poorer.
They didn't, well, one of them left. You think they got poorer? Well, there's no income category 2, is there, at the top there? That kind of gives it away. But you're absolutely right. Say that. So, some of them died. What did Keane say in the long run? We're all dead. But yes, there's a distribution. One household retaining its wealth and all the others declining. Notice then the contrast between what was going on between the very rich and the very poor. The very poor, just 3 households remaining the same, and the very rich, only one household maintaining its level of wealth. And this is partly, this is for a variety of reasons: household senescence, divorce, through investing in the second wife, which was extremely expensive, having goods which depreciated. Tractors break down, and you lose income that way. So that the decline in the wealthier groups is not that surprising, but it's the increase in of well-being, the improvement in well-being in the poorer groups, which was unexpected. So what might cause that? We did a mixture of oral histories and village group meetings, and 2 reasons which came up were simply less alcoholism and less exploitation. So the exploitation refers to the fact that in the early 1990s, you still had these very wealthy farmers, still had all these tractors, everyone given their 4 acres of land, but not everybody able to farm it because it was heavy clay soils, and for a variety of other reasons. And so the farmers with the tractors effectively still owned the means of production. And they could determine the exchange rates and were still able to the rental rates. And they were still able to cultivate very large areas of land. As people got wealthier, as they invested in ploughs and oxen, the terms that the richer farmers were able to dictate became more beneficial, they weren't able to dictate the terms in such a strict way. More people were able to farm their own land more independently. And another common cause was the fact that people became less alcoholic. This was a common story that was mentioned. People were very poor because of their alcohol dependency, and then they either got very sick, or they became Pentecostal and stopped drinking, or they still were drunk, but their children had taken control of the land from them and stopped them from mismanaging it. Notice here that both of these reasons suggest that increases in well-being could be completely independent from any change in GDP. Whatever's going on in the country doesn't necessarily affect what's going on in the village. There have been improvements in services. There are more clinics, there are more milling machines, and there are more water points in these villages before. In other words, some aspects of women's labour have become dramatically easier than they were in the past. And there are some interesting trends in crop prices, and this is where the food cash crops become important. If you look at the average prices in early 1990s and the average prices in the 3 years before the study, you'll see that they have generally, controlling for purchasing power parity or the consumer price index, it comes out the same way, they've generally increased 2 to 3-fold in terms of their value. So maize has virtually doubled in terms of its value. Potatoes have increased 3 times as much. These are substantial increases in farm gate prices. But if farmers, or if rural people here are, and many of them will be, net consumers of food, this will make them poorer because they'll be paying more than they were before. In which case, one possibility here may be to consider the relative terms of trade, sort of relative exchange rates between maize and other crops. If maize is your staple, then you want to get enough maize to live off. But you can exchange beans for maize or potatoes for maize in order to get that staple. And we can see that, for example, if you look at wheat grown in this area, You used to be able to exchange 100 kilograms of wheat for 100 kilograms of maize. Now you can exchange 3 sacks of wheat for 4 of maize. You're more likely to be able to live off your wheat sales than you were before. With beans, it's even better. It used to be 3 sacks of beans for 2 sacks of beans, for 3 of wheat. Now you get 2 sacks of beans for 2 sacks of beans for 3 of maize. Now it's 2 sacks of beans for 5 of maize. So you get a better terms of trade. If you graph it, it looks like that. And you can see that the red line is the maize down the bottom, and those wonderful coloured jumps on the right-hand side are the increase in value of the other food cash crops. You'll notice as well that the reason why I'm comparing the average between in the early 1990s and the average in the 3 years before my study is that I don't have the data for the rest of the 1990s to give you the clear trend. We couldn't get those from the records, but I have found a very good record for the 1990s where you can see that little small text down the right-hand side. Those are all the data points from across Tanzania, with the black line being the average. You can see that, in fact, the early 1990s, according to this graph, represents an increase in the value of maize prices, and thereafter, the value of maize has declined through to the early 2000s, which suggests that if there has been any increase because of change in food prices, as you can see from this graph, then it isn't something which began in the 1990s and moved and went forward, but something which has happened much more recently in the last 15 years. So what? 1 study, 1 village, 77 households. What could you possibly conclude from this other than the possibility that Brian might be right about this instance? This is just anecdotal data. What we require is some means of seeing how this study compares to others. And this is where Tanzania becomes a particularly interesting case, simply because the COSTECH records, the Commission for Science and Technology, will tell you who has worked in the country as a foreigner, and will tell you, effectively, who has been conducting similar surveys like this in the early 1990s. The East Africana Library at the University of Dar es Salaam has all the master's theses and PhD theses published by Tanzanians at universities in the country. Again, a record of good surveys. And the general trend is, with PhD students and postdoctoral students, they don't throw away their data. They will have somewhere a list of households that they went to visit, making it possible to revisit the earlier households. Which sounds great, but you need the money. Unfortunately, we're at the final stages of negotiating 3 years of funding from DFID ESRC in the latest round, which will give us a 3-year study with 4 investigators and a postdoc. This will start in January. Please send us your best applicants for this, because this will hinge on the quality of the postdoc. It will also involve, and again, this is what we're actually negotiating, because we have this work hinges upon building up a good network of people who know where the surveys are, and also inviting people to resurvey places they went to in the 1990s. If you have a survey that was conducted in the 1990s, if it's good enough quality, would you like to go back there? Would you like to meet the people that you met in the 1990s, renew those relationships? Would you like us to pay for the ticket? Would you like us to pay for your transport? Do cows go moo? There's also then an element of that which is open to other researchers to join in. This is what we're trying to negotiate with ESRC DFID, because they want names to these funds, and we're saying it is not part of the project. And there's also a key element of oversight of meetings. So please, tell other people about this. This project hinges upon the success of the broader network which is built around it in order to identify the surveys which might be suitable candidates for resurveying. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. Excellent.
Good morning. This morning I argue that power tillers from advanced countries are of higher quality than those coming from emerging economies. However, those from emerging economies are more pro-poor than those coming from advanced countries. Now, it's even difficult for me to build my foundations, because now it's like we no longer believe that poverty is an issue to some extent, and the house may continue to be divided. But from the data we have, at least based on the household surveys, we'll continue to say that even though growth has occurred, we have not seen a decline in poverty. And the point is that the growth that we see occurs in services and industry, but not as much in the agricultural sector, which employs a greater chunk of the population. And we are led to believe that for poverty to decline, agricultural sector ought to grow. And one way to get it to grow is to get the requisite machines for the farmers to use. The technology they use ought to change from hand hoes to maybe oxen plow and then tractors and power tillers. But that has not happened. And we want to see how best that can take off. We've seen a change in the world order, where currently China and India have become prominent in producing machines. And in as far as China and India are in themselves developing countries, we believe that the machines they produce are likely to be useful to relatively poor farmers who are also found in Tanzania. In the past, most of the machines, especially small tillers and then the tractors that Tanzanians used, came from the EU, America, or Japan. But in recent times, we see some of them coming from China, India, and Pakistan. And what I'm going to do today is to try and compare these machines and the extent to which the two sources are pro-poor. If a farmer, an average farmer in Tanzania wants to make a choice, usually he thinks about the scale of his farm, whether the machine is durable, the skills he has, and the access to the machines. The cost is also important. But you all agree with me that the Tanzanian farmer usually farms between 2 and 3 acres of land. And it may be wishful thinking that he should go in for large tractors which come from Europe, rather than considering smaller tractors which perhaps are cheaper and within his reach in terms of being able to buy. If you look at the farm sizes across the world, African farm sizes are more similar to those in Asia, as opposed to those which are in Latin America or even the Caribbean, and then the North America or Europe. Therefore, machines that Indians and Chinese produce for their farms could fit the purpose for Tanzanians also. This graph shows that clearly China and India are becoming important suppliers of power tillers and tractors in Tanzania in recent years. And we would want to know why that is happening. In 2012 and part of 2013, I set out to answer this question about the pro-poor nature of machines which come from emerging economies and those which come from matured markets. And so I wanted to know the mode through which they are transferred, the extent to which farmers are using them, and the distinctive nature they possess. And if they are distinct, I also wanted to find out whether they are appropriate for the Tanzanian farmer. So basically, I've spoken to about 200 farmers, but today I present data on 96 of them who are using small power tillers. I hypothesize that in terms of scale, the spare parts availability, skill requirements, efficiency and durability, and even the acquisition cost, they are increasing for machines which come from matured markets, and they are decreasing for those which come from emerging economies. So this morning, I hope to compare 4 machines. The first comes from Japan, the second is from Thailand, the fourth from India, and the third from India, and the fourth from China. The Kubota power tiller is a very durable machine. You can use it for 10 to 12 years. The Siam Kubota is a Japanese machine which has been manufactured in Thailand, and the quality has been reduced a bit. Generally, they used manual assembly as opposed to the use of robots in assembling the one in Japan. The Greaves power tiller, which comes from India, has been adapted from the Mitsubishi power tiller made in Japan. And then the AMEC, the final one, is a Chinese technology made in China. And I'm going to try and see how these 4 machines compare. The first 2 are from the advanced countries, and then the second 2 are from the emerging economies. So the first objective was to find out how these machines are transferred. Generally, the machines which came from advanced countries were supported by government through aid or bilateral agreements. But those which are coming from the emerging economies are generally brought in by entrepreneurs through trade. Now, what is the extent of diffusion? Currently, if you take every 10 power tillers in Tanzania, about 6 to 7 of them come from China and India, whereas the remaining 30 come from Japan and Korea. But to get us to the onset, most of the initial machines which came to Tanzania were from Japan and Korea. But over time, we've seen the Chinese machines and the Indian machines overtaking those from Japan. I also try to compare how distinctive the machines are. And generally, the price of machines which come from Japan especially can be more than 2 times that which is coming from China. If you look at the spare parts, the prices also compares in the same manner. The cost of lubricants, etc., are also higher for the advanced country ones. Then if you look at the amount of work the advanced country machines can do per season, the Japanese ones and the Thai ones do better than the Chinese ones. Generally, the machines which come from Japan can plow on dry soils. But if you use the Chinese machines to plow on dry soils, they don't last long. The furthest you can use it is just for about 2 years. So there are quality differences. However, because the Chinese machines are heavy, it's able to employ more people per acre plowed. So if employment is any objective for the country, then machines coming from emerging economies are more, give more opportunities for employment than those which come from the advanced countries. So I also wanted to find out the productivity ratios. It's clear that the advanced country machines are usually capital intensive, whereas those coming from the emerging economies are mostly labor intensive. And then the output productivity, we also find that the Chinese machines are doing better. And then if you look at the benefit cost ratios, even though the Chinese machines are unable to do so much work, when you compare the benefits to the cost, it performs better than the Japanese ones. However, we all want to see area cultivated increased. If that is one of our objectives, then the Chinese cannot support the poor farmer as much as the Thailand or the Japanese ones can do. Now, I also asked the farmers who are using the matured market machines and those who are using the emerging economy machines, whether they have seen increment in their farm sizes. If you look clearly, both groups saw an increment of about 20 acres. So regardless of the machines they are using, all of them saw a 20-acre increase. And the difference we see is not significant. Then the number of people who are distributing emerging economy power tillers and those who are distributing matured market ones, we find that when you count 6 distributors for Chinese machines, you can count 1 for the Japanese. And 1 in 4 of 4 people who are repairing machines on the ground are for Japan, and the 4 are for Chinese, meaning that there is more opportunities for employment when the Chinese machines are chosen over the Japanese ones. There was also a case where there was a woman farmer distributing spare parts. And this was not Japanese spare parts, they were Chinese ones, because the capital required to start such a business was low and the women could participate. Then we also see more and more women also owning more Chinese power tillers than the Japanese ones. On one of the irrigation schemes, there were 20 women who had power tillers, and 1 out of every four was a Japanese, and the remaining 3 were coming from China. So we see clearly that the Chinese machines and the Indian machines may not be robust, but they are providing opportunity for more employment and giving more people in society more jobs. So I did a simple simulation here and tried to look at how much jobs could be created across the value chain if we took all the money available for farmers to buy machines and then spent it on the different types of machines I've listed. The story is the same. Clearly, emerging economy power tillers provides more jobs across the value chain. And as jobs are created, capacity is built, people now learn the skill of importing and distributing, people learn the skill of using machines, repairing machines, etc. But the Japanese machines usually do not break down often. So the repairers don't even have the opportunity to look at the machine and know what is happening in there. So these Chinese machines provide opportunity for skills to develop. Finally, I wanted to find from the farmers whether the machines they are using are appropriate. The red lines are for the emerging economy ones, and then the is for the matured market, the blue. Most of the farmers, this is on a scale of 1 to 7, felt that they cannot afford the Japanese machines. But those who use the Chinese machines, it was easy to do so. For instance, in a year when they harvest 30 bags of rice, they could sell all that and buy a machine. But if they want to buy a Japanese machine, it will take them about 3 years. Sell all their bags of rice, 30 bags of rice for 3 years before they can buy a Japanese machine. So the access and ability to even enter the market is more difficult if one wants to use the Japanese machines. I want to briefly touch on health, safety, and environment. The Chinese machines overheat, they are heavy and affect the spine negatively. It also makes a lot of noise and disturbs the ear. The Japanese machines have relatively high standards, and there's more research to ensure that people who use them do not get sick. But the question is, will we wait forever until we have money to buy an excellent machine before we can participate in production, or we should first of all use the ones from China, gather some resources, and then think about buying higher quality machines? These are questions that ought to run through our minds as we think about making the choice for the farmer. I would want to conclude, based on these few points, that the fact that the Chinese machines break down often means that they need to be repaired regularly. Therefore, users ought to be trained as to how to maintain them and to repair them. So retraining for them is required. There is another issue where all the people who test machines which come into Tanzania have been trained in Japan. But now there are machines coming into Tanzania from China and India. Therefore, there needs to be basic training for these, the people at Kamatech, to understand the new ways the Chinese and the Indians are producing their machines, so that the right testing can be done. Now, every machine imported into Tanzania enjoys a subsidy of about 47%. That is, the VAT is waived, and then the import duty is waived. One waiver for a Japanese machine can waive for 3 people who are buying Chinese machines. So the question is, how best should government spend her money? Is it to give opportunity to more people or to give opportunity to fewer people? The Chinese machines also do not have warranty. Therefore, most banks shy away from giving loans to farmers to buy them. But clearly, the benefit-cost ratios show that the Chinese machines are more profitable. And so banks should be encouraged to give loans to people who intend buying these machines. I want to end with two quotes. One, which is of Chinese origin, and the second of European origin. It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. So this is the former premier of China. So maybe the Chinese machines are of lower quality, but it's doing the work that is required. But obviously, for richer populations, we will consider that the bitterness of poor quality remains long after low pricing is forgotten. So this is the big debate, and where should the farmer consider look into? Thank you very much.
Okay.
We're going to present about textile waste management in Dar es Salaam. Our background is textile design, and so we're not, if our terminology isn't quite right, we apologise right from the start. We hope to present an overview of the end-of-life textiles recycling systems. We're going to introduce the context of the project within which we were looking at end-of-life waste textiles. We're going to look at second-hand clothing imports into Tanzania, waste management systems, textile recycling processes, and implications for policy. The project itself is funded by the University of Huddersfield, and the aim is to look at ways of diverting textiles from landfill by finding a route to recycle them. We're working with an automotive textiles company. They design textiles for automotives. They currently do use some pre-consumer textile waste, which is polyester, in the design for the car seat coverings and headliners. But the automotive industry does already use waste textiles anyway within waddings and the cushions, cushioning areas of chairs. So the automotive industry was an interesting one to look at. Through SAGE, we've been able to examine their design process, the supply chain issues, and as part of the project, we were able to also go to Tanzania to look at what happens to textile waste once it arises in Tanzania. And really that's where the project kind of started. What happens to textiles once they're no longer wanted by the consumers in Tanzania? So we interviewed a range of people, from waste collectors to the city council in Dar es Salaam, as well as market traders. We visited the landfill site and collected textiles from a variety of areas with the view to bringing them back and characterising them to look for possibilities of how to recycle the textiles. So we have textiles from the landfill site, which is fully decontaminated before we brought it back. Textiles from various sources, the second-hand stores, the retail stores, so we were able to get textiles that were newly made as well as locally produced, so we characterised those as well. And really we were looking at this from a systems perspective. In 2006, Jana Hawley described the approach to textile recycling as a systems approach, and the point we want to make here is that what we do as individuals and what we buy into within the fashion system as a whole. There is a vast amount of people and network that are involved in this whole process. Textile recycling is one of those important processes that helps to negotiate how we value clothing and what we do with the clothing once we no longer want or need it. So the project looks at two sides. The UK side, which is the bit that we're all familiar with, and what happens when it goes to Tanzania. So the dark grey box is the area that we're actually interested to understand if and how it can be developed. So when textiles reach Tanzania, they are sold through the second-hand markets. The situation is complicated by the fact that the incoming imports of clothing and the rise in fashion, as everywhere else, the fashion knowledge and the desire to be seen to be fashionable has increased the amount of textiles that are within the cities, certainly, but we don't see the waste management systems that are there to deal with the increased waste through the increase in choice that is now available to citizens.
Right, I'll take over. Can you hear me first? I'll just check. Good. Okay. So basically, there are options for end of life of textiles at all the different areas within the EU waste hierarchy. So the avoidance and minimisation area, that's slightly difficult. That relies on sustainable production and consumption, and there are massive technical and economic challenges to that. However, basically what we can say is that for the rest of the hierarchy, as we descend it in terms of broadly in terms of the environmental benefit that we receive from the various processes we use with textiles. But we also descend it in terms of the economic benefit, the economic recovery that we get back from those textiles as we go from reuse down to disposal. So in order for us to really sort of think about these materials, one of the impacts of that is that when we think about the economics of it, it's very important, or the best benefit is derived from reuse in terms of both economics and environment. Now, the reuse market in the global north has very much become saturated. There are more and more clothes, we're buying more and more, we're disposing of them more and more rapidly, which therefore means that compared with the cost of clothing getting cheaper and cheaper in the global north means that we've got to find other markets for it. And historically, one of those other markets has significantly been in sub-Saharan Africa. And for the UK, traditionally in Tanzania, but that's actually changed significantly over recent years. So immediately post-independence, most second-hand clothing imports into Tanzania came from the UK. That's because they built on existing trade relationships that existed during the colonial periods. But those existing trade relationships have started to shift and change. We can think of that as an uncoordinated network. It's driven by relationships which don't necessarily have an economic benefit with them. It costs more to ship from the UK. Our cost of living and the cost of our textiles is slightly more expensive than it is in other areas. So therefore, that's meant that the clothing prices for second-hand textiles from the UK are relatively high. As we've seen a massive increase in second-hand clothing imports since the 1980s, we've also seen other markets opening, and there's been a significant change and a rapid change since 2006. And that's reflected in Tanzania's changing trade relationships. It's reflected in reciprocal trade. Even though being able to reuse textiles is one of the more economic ways of getting use out of environmental treatment of textiles, it's still a relatively low value trade. So therefore it tends to be either through reciprocal trading routes or as a make-up cargo alongside other things that are shipped. So as trade relationships develop, so as exports for Tanzania develop between different countries, the likelihood of clothing coming from those different places tends to increase. So what we see is that since 1995, well, since 2000 really, we see a rapid decline in UK exports to Tanzania. At the same time, we see a massive rise of North America imports. And that's really rocketed since 2006. And one of the things that I find quite interesting about that is that coincides with America's increased use of the UAE as a free zone. So actually, there's quite a lot of clothing that goes into the UAE from North America, which is then transported from UAE to Tanzania. And actually that's given 3 routes in, which means that most of the clothing that we see, and we saw actually when we were out there, can be traced back largely to North America, mainly to the United States, and through their trading agreements with Canada and through Canada's shipping agreements with Tanzania, we're seeing a lot of North American textiles coming in. They're also extremely popular with people in Tanzania, and particularly with the young urban youth, which is corresponding to rises in interest in hip-hop, in interest in American culture. At the same time, as Tanzania's economy grows, so does their desirability as a retail market. So Dar es Salaam's desirability as a retail market for South African clothing chains and for Chinese clothing chains is meaning that there's more new clothing coming in. So overall, the net effect is there's a significant increase in flow of textiles into Tanzania at this time. So one of the questions we have then is, what's the implication for that? Is it staying in the city? And largely our observations would say that a lot of these materials are staying in the city. There are mechanisms to get them out to smaller communities and villages, but the bulk is staying within the city. So the first question is it staying within the city? And the second question is, how does the waste management processes based in the city work with that? So this then comes back to the idea that the population within the city is growing. Second-hand clothing, not only, we're trying to think about whether second-hand clothing markets will remain, and they're historically volatile. You know, there are local legislations and there are kind of changes in governments, there are changes in approaches in the West, in the global North, which influence those things as well. But our prediction says that given that they offer a reasonably easy entry trade for people who are moving into informal settlements in Tanzania, coupled with the growth of those informal settlements in Tanzania, and coupled with the lack of innovation in avoidance and minimisation in the global North, seems to imply that we're going to see a continuing rise. And even if we don't see a continuing rise, we'll see a stabilisation in those rates of clothing that's going into Dar es Salaam itself. So that puts quite a lot of pressure on the waste management system. A standard waste management system for textiles relies on initial source separation so that we can remove anything that might contaminate it from the from the rest of the waste. It relies on a separate collection in order to be able to capitalise on those things, and it relies on storage so that they don't get contaminated or develop mildew. It relies on sorting so we can determine what is available for reuse, what's available for recycling, and what can only go into disposal. Now, the waste management system in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam itself, is what Scheinberg has referred to as a modernised mixtures approach, which means that it's a public-private partnership, and private contractors tend to collect from plant settlements where the infrastructure is good, whereas NGOs and CBOs tend to collect from unplanned settlements, which is where the largest area of development is currently in Dar es Salaam. So those unplanned settlements, they don't have particularly good infrastructure for you to be able to get the textiles out. You know, the road quality isn't particularly good, which means that you're typically limited to carts. CBOs are usually driven in those areas by the desirability to improve the quality of life in the area. They're not necessarily driven by thinking about the sort of smaller sectors of things. So they'd rather get the waste out and into the Puguki and Nyamwezi waste site than they would think about actually recovering that waste in some way, if that becomes more difficult than for, say, standards such as glass, metal and plastics, where there are existing recycling systems. So what tends to happen is the textile waste is going from the unplanned settlements via CBOs to the landfill. In the plant settlements, the private contractors, their negotiation with the government, with the councils over franchises, they typically should be based on their ability to meet the bylaws. But in our interviews, it was implied that it's based on how much you can say you'll do it for, which gives them very little profit for innovation. So there's very little that they will do in terms of thinking about other than the already profitable waste streams for recycling. So written into the Dar es Salaam waste policy is a process of source separation, but actually in practice that's typically not working. Collection rates have increased massively, but in the unplanned settlements they're quite periodic. So people don't want waste hanging around, and so they're tending to not separate the waste. If it's not collected within certain time frames, it's either disposed of illegally or it's burnt. And all of these textiles that are present in there are all contributing towards this. About 37% of the waste that's generated domestically in Dar es Salaam actually reaches the one landfill at Pugu Kimanyesi. So we can see that for some things, this was lovely Mr. Manfred Leoto, who was showing us that recycling systems do exist. They exist for plastics because there's a strong overseas market for plastic bottles. They exist for metals because there's a strong local market for metals. And they exist in a very small scale for glass. They used to exist for textiles, but actually the price that the informal sector can gain for picking textiles has decreased, whilst the price that they can gain for picking metals and plastics has increased, and the net effect is that people have stopped picking up textiles and they've started picking up metals and plastics. So we can see that there are some rudimentary systems that are allowing people to weigh, to sort, but they're not being used for textiles. And the net effect of that is that although textiles only makes up about 3% of the domestic waste stream, in practice, when you get to Pugu Kimanyesi, which is where Pammi on the right is, and Claire on the left is picking up our sample. I didn't get to go, so I was quite happy about that. As they're picking up their samples there, they see that there's far more than 3 to 10%. We haven't actually evaluated how much textile there was on landfill. It was outside the scope of the project, and it's something we'd really be interested in doing. But it was a significant proportion of what was actually there. And when I mentioned about America, we'll come back about North American imports, we'll come back to that because that's actually quite significant in terms of what the composition of those materials are. Even in these days of globalization, the composition of the materials varies according to tastes in the global north, and that varies according to what you can actually do with those textiles in their end market. Okay.
So after we collected those textiles and we were looking to see how they may be used once we found some recycling systems, we actually came across some papers that were written for the RAP. The government have organised some research to look at waste textiles because of the environmental impact. So as a result of the RAP work, Morley et al. In 2013 did quite an extensive review of the end markets for waste textiles and for recycled textiles. And the light blue boxes in this slide indicate the end markets that are currently commercially available for recycled textiles. Right from at the top, we get reuse, which is the least environmental. It's really just reusing the product for its original purpose, right through to where it's very pelletized and made into pellets and granules and used as energy for waste. So there are a lot of market applications for waste textiles, but I guess what we're trying to say is that it has to be appropriate for the marketplace, and this slide really is just to illustrate that innovation is necessary within the textiles sector and certainly within the textile recycling sector, but unless we have a perfect mix between the organizational processes, the innovation, the markets, and the way that it's applied in these markets, it's quite difficult to actually have a commercially viable process taking place. Okay, so I mentioned before that it was important to think about where the textiles have come from.
So we talk about globalised textiles and we talk about globalised marketplaces. But actually, in practice, the tastes of the audience in the global north influence what the composition is in the landfill in the global south. So we can see that typically in an Oxfam donation that goes to the global south, and largely in their case to Senegal, there's a high proportion of cotton. Now, cotton's really useful for the traditional end markets in Tanzania, which used to be wipers, rags, and for household goods, and also for stuffing and padding in mattresses. Now, in Dar es Salaam itself and in the landfill rags, which, taking into account the fact that most of these were found on the top level, would sort of imply that there isn't time for the breakdown of the cotton. So this is basically broadly the composition of the textiles. We can see that there's a huge proportion of polyester and polycellulose blends. And the polycellulose blends are typically larger polyester than they are cellulose. So when we start to see that, we start to think, well, actually, those end markets now that that Dar es Salaam has traditionally relied on, those materials are not necessarily appropriate for them. They're not particularly absorbent, they're not particularly effective for those end markets. In most of the global north countries, the end markets that there are for recycled textiles are satisfied by local industry. So there aren't really massive export markets currently either. So in terms of thinking about the environmental impact of those things actually on the landfill, the studies suggest that the presence of so much polyester might imply less absorbance to the landfill itself, greater leachates, and greater levels of water pools and malaria. So it provides breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and mosquitoes then can transmit malaria. That's a very different environmental impact to the idea of a proportion of cotton within the landfill. So the environmental effect of the materials and the composition is entirely dependent on the composition. So we have these kind of questions about how does that composition affect? And actually the proportion of polyester is going up in day-to-day clothing as well. So this is going to be something that we have to deal with in the future. So at the moment, the only ways in which recycling markets are developed in Dar es Salaam is if there is an end market existing, if that's already there, and if you can actually capitalise on that straight away. There's very little innovation and very little opportunity because there's very little money. People are more, understandably, getting the waste to the landfill where it can be dealt with in one location is more important at this point than determining those recycling markets. Not necessarily in my opinion, but certainly in terms of the policy. So what's actually happening is that therefore the proportion of polyester is increasing in the landfill, and the effects for what is a relatively small fraction are likely to be increasing as well. So there's a conflict between the economic and social need, and a conflict between there's a conflict between the economic and social and environmental needs. And in general, there's a question about how do policymakers deal with that? Can they deal with it? Do we need some other form? And also there's a fundamental question which is kind of central to it, which is whose responsibility is it? And we can't find an answer to that, but it's something we'd like you to think about. So this seems to be, in my head, a significant export of an environmental problem. So at that point, I guess we'll leave. Yeah. So, well, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So Dan, let me not say in each case the presentation was really interesting, it was. I think I was slightly shocked as a non-expert in this that so much debt, so the assets include, and also expenditure on issues to do with education and so on, are so generally not taken into account in the statistics that are collected. And I just wonder, I'd just like to invite you to comment. I mean, I can see the great value in scaling up this study in Tanzania. But I just wonder, was that a particular characteristic of Tanzania, or is this in general? And because obviously we have MDGs that relate to the other, other indicators besides basic expenditure on food and so on. So I just wonder whether you could comment on the sort of more wider issue about what this implies about data sources and ways of recovering that, because we can't do massive scaled-up projects everywhere. Well, you can, but you need to inscribe them into government statistical and aid donor statistical data collection systems. So I just wonder whether you could comment on that. With Andrew, again, fascinating. I just wonder, and I'd like you to comment on how sensitive your results to do with this comparison depend upon the criteria you use. I mean, you're particularly weighting heavily issues to do with job creation, direct job creation. So if things break down more often, you create more jobs in repairing. But obviously, you know, in terms of job direction, you've got to think creation. You've got to think more generally in terms of microeconomics and so on. In terms of indirect job creation, there's a counter argument that says if you're more productive in doing what you do, then you generate more wealth and therefore generate more secondary jobs and so on. And similarly, there's a sort of interaction with assumptions to do with the cost, because, as you say, a lot of the Japanese machines are imported through development aid rather than trade, and therefore these sort of direct price comparisons are a little tricky. So I suppose the general question is, how are you grappling with that methodological challenge that that the outputs depend very sensitively on the way you're managing the inputs? And finally, for Pammi, Katharine and Claire, again fascinating. I suppose the start question is, so this sounds very reminiscent of the sort of challenges and debates in Huddersfield and elsewhere in EU and other countries of once recycling processes really started to get going in the 1970s, 1980s, that the actual most effective way of regulating that depended very sensitively on trends in terms of the inputs of the waste, and also regulatory incentives to manage price in order to cope. And so I suppose my question is, how directly transferable do you think the lessons for EU and elsewhere for managing to regulate that are to Dar es Salaam and similar developing country cities? Or do you think there are other angles too that need to be taken into account? So dwell on those for a moment, and then we'll just see if we'll take a first round of questions, and then we'll take it from there. Please.
Hi, my question is for Andrew. I'm William Suarez from Puerto Rico. My background is in agricultural engineer, and Dr. Bossi is my supervisor. I have just a question specifically. You said at the end of your presentation that both equipments, more or less, or just Chinese equipment, present as some kind of potentially harmless for the users, specifically about the sound or the noisy or other areas. How do you measure, or how methods you use to evaluate the human harmless or potentially human harmless? Because in my opinion, if it's effective, the equipment in the field, it's not necessarily pro-poor in long term, because at the end of the day, it's effective in the field, but the users maybe suffer issues at the end of the day, and maybe became poorest when he finished his job. And the cost sometimes maybe have another worse effects. So this is my question.
Thank you. Lady there, gentleman there.
Thank you. Susanna Salu, University of Leeds. I've got two questions for Dan, if that's okay. The first one was, why was your title on wellbeing and then your focus on livelihoods assets? I wonder if you could maybe explain to us about that. And then secondly, were you able to get a sense of any demographic changes or dynamics going on within the households that you resurveyed? My statement about death was a little bit morbid, but I would just wondered to what extent the sort of if the survey was household heads, for example, how ageing and sort of changes within the families themselves whether you were able to capture any of that, because of course that links to some of the issues that I think are being experienced at the moment with regards to sort of families, elders dying and then redistributing lands to to the young generation, of which there are very many. So it would be interesting to hear if you've got any of those insights. Thank you.
Okay, and one final question at this round, so gentleman behind them.
Hi, my name is Zach Mwanje from Global Higher Education Partnerships. I've got just a question for Dawn and a question for the two ladies from Huddersfield. The question for Dawn is linked with Suzanne, because your title was looking at well-being. And to what extent did you take into account, particularly for the richer, the very rich, and the rich, some of the migration in the dropping down in the social status? To what extent did you take into account HIV/AIDS at the time? Because in the 1990s, it was quite rife in the majority of African countries, and that had a major impact on both the economic well-being and general health well-being. The other question, which is to the two ladies on solid waste management, let me first confess that I did a lot of work in Dar es Salaam, working with a gentleman that was shown on one of your slides, Mr. Kato, for more than 10 years. And we're looking at CBOs and CBEs and looking at all the infrastructures. I just want to find out to what extent you took into account some of the work that had been done previously.
Okay, well, thanks for that first round. Obviously, there are going to be other rounds, but let me invite, first of all, Dan, maybe. Yes. Do you want to grab, just speak into it?
Sure, thanks very much for the questions. With respect to the household budget survey, the magic machine should, if you could let the machine display the click safe, that would be great. It'll bring up, I don't need to read it out to you, the actual text which explains how the assets are removed from or not explored within the household budget survey. It's quite explicit and quite deliberate. It has its own purposes. These collect valuable data for other reasons and other causes. Just because it doesn't collect assets doesn't mean it's not useful for those purposes.
But aren't there other, I suppose that the heart of my question, aren't there other data, routine data collection systems that would get more at some of your issues?
Yes, the Living Standard Measurement Survey, which is began in 2007-8, I believe, and then a second round in 2010-11. The key thing here is these are panel data. So these are going back to the same households. And if you want to understand livelihood change, particularly asset change, you tend to need panel data. Now, what we don't have in Tanzania and many African countries are good panel data. And far from this being expensive, this is actually an extremely cheap way of generating panel data, if it works, compared to the normal ways of doing panel data. Well-being and livelihoods. Don't read too much into this. I was looking at my work and thinking, there's no livelihood change at all there. They began farming, they're farming a bit more. This is much more about prosperity than anything else. And as to the detail of within the household dynamics and the question of morbidity, at this level, I can't provide any interesting information there. What I was interested in the first instance was the move across category and the oral histories and social histories, collected histories, which were associated with that. What we don't have yet are Visa Mati's original surveys, which would have included the actual livestock numbers, land numbers, demography, who was present in the household, and then the fate of what happened to all those people. That's what the more detailed work would be required to do.
And the HIV question?
Again, morbidity. We didn't have levels. I don't think Visa Mati in his survey collected any information about who was suffering from HIV/AIDS. I don't think in the early 1990s that would have been available either. It makes a more general point that one of the key methodological issues that will affect any scaling up of this work is that when you're comparing multiple different surveys, well, hopefully there'll be information on land access and land ownership. But each survey will have a particular focus, and I think that, particularly for the early 1990s, very few of them are going to be able explicitly to say what levels of morbidity were due particularly to some forms of disease. From individual household surveys. Wonderful.
So Andrew, maybe. What's the next?
William, okay. I would like to start by saying that the majority of Tanzanian small-scale farmers plow with hand hoes, and it takes 1 man, 5 hours a day for 12 days to plow an acre with a hand hoe. And if they use oxen, then it takes 2 men with a pair of oxen for 2 days. And this power tiller from China uses 3.5 hours to plow an acre. The one from Japan uses, let's say, 2.8 hours to plow an acre. So but definitely, originally, the Tanzanian farmer was expending a lot of energy on the tillage. Now, if he has something which can do the work in 3.5 hours, and he can afford it, I think it's a better route than to wait forever until he can buy one which will finish the work in 2.8 hours. So, if you look at it critically, yes, there are issues about the weight of the Chinese machines. The gears are heavy, the machine itself is heavy, it's noisy, and it's even overheat. But if you ask the average operator to choose between a hand hoe and the Chinese power tiller, they possibly would take the power tiller. So the general point is that, yes, we've not gotten to the desired point, but the Chinese machines offers an intermediate between the hand hoe and the Japanese ones. So generally, the assessment on whether the machine affects the farmer's usage is assessed by the farmer. They tell me, they rate the noise when they are using it, and they rate the vibration. I didn't use the machines which we use for measuring. So it's a rating by the farmer. I don't think we should respond to yours now.
Yes, respond to me now, yeah.
Okay,
same,
good.
Same status as all the others.
Good.
Yeah.
So coming back to the power tillers, at the beginning of the 2000s, Tanzanians were not using power tillers. So in 2001, the Japanese government, and I think with collaboration with the American government, donated 270 Japanese machines, which were expected to start off the use of the machines. But since then, the ones that people have been able to buy with their own money, I don't think it's up to 500. Then the Chinese ones came in through the open market. Then people started buying them much more. Then in 2006, the Japanese opened another plant in Thailand to produce a reduced form of their version, which now constitutes about 25%. So obviously both are being bought, and there are current market prices that can be taken as replacement cost and then compared. So the issue about comparison is possible. The prices of both the equipment and the spare parts are available on the market. And then the job creation. Everywhere I go, I continue to say that it may sound silly to think that for a machine to break down often is beneficial to the poor. But we need to get the economy working. You can buy a Japanese power tiller and use it for 8 years, no breakdowns. So there is no subsidiary, how do we call them? Derivatives for other markets, spare parts, repairers. But the Chinese ones, they break down, they also supply the spare parts. And one other difficulty with the Japanese one is that because they do not easily give people the opportunity to sell the parts, the spare parts are also difficult to come by. So I agree, the Chinese machines have their own challenges. But in terms of a financially constrained society, it is, I think, in my opinion, it's better for us to consider it in the intermediate term and then in future move on. The challenge is that when some farmers want to move on to the Thailand or the Japanese one, sometimes they place orders and they don't even get them. So some of the things we need to work on in the innovation system is to make it possible that people who have owned the Chinese machines for 2 or 3 years or 5 years and now have saved money and they want to buy the Japanese one, it should be available to them. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I guess markets will sort this out too. So over to Pammi and Katharine.
In response to the question about how much prior research, the first thing we should do is sort of preface this and say that actually we were looking particularly at the context of textile recycling. So we weren't necessarily looking at the role of CBOs in waste management in general. Having said that, we did obviously go out and have a look at the general literature on CBOs in waste management and identified that collection systems had been the priority mainly, that they had become very efficient and that there was shared infrastructure between the public and private sectors within being able to collect. So some of those problems of infrastructure in the area were overcome by these shared relationships between the two people. In terms of looking specifically at textile recycling, we identified some previous costs which people had identified as what the waste pickers were typically earning, and then we interviewed some waste pickers to follow up on that. And within that, we identified that amongst the waste pickers who work on Pugu Kinmanwezi, only one waste picker was still collecting textiles, and that was coupled with collecting glass as well because he already had an existing market. Everybody else said there's just no value in there, and they weren't able to do that. So whilst we've looked at CBOs, we've looked at them specifically in their ability at the moment to encourage recycling of textiles. We also spoke to a small scope project who've been working on that, and they were unable to even find end markets for pre-consumer waste. That's the stuff that isn't in the landfill, the stuff that isn't contaminated, and the stuff that's of the quality that you could imagine the material would have been in the first place. And the markets they were really struggling to identify markets there. So from that perspective, but you've got more to add, haven't you, on this one?
Yes, we did follow up with discussing the project and to see what more we should be doing by visiting the universities. So we went to RD Institute and talked to the waste management experts over there to see what they had been doing and what they could advise us. And we worked with the University of Dar es Salaam, who helped us conduct all the interviews and decontaminated the rags that we found from the landfill site. So it was a very short visit, so there was a limit to how much we could actually do. But yes, we tried to get us up to date with our collection, but obviously taking into account what we'd read in previous papers.
Okay, second round. So the gentleman just on the second table back, put down yourself. So just stand there. And then third one.
My name is Soko. I'm a student in Bradford. I have a question to the Dan presentation. Could you show me the table 6 of your presentation?
The what, sorry? Table 6.
Table 6.
Which one is table 6? There's lots of tables. This one?
Yes. Yeah, table 6. I have a very short question. Why you focus on the potato and I want to know the reason why you because all of things is they have gap, but why you specifically to focus on that? And could you show me next slide? Please, next slide. Yeah, between 1980 to 1985 is very, its price is very increasing. After then, they are rapidly decreasing the prices. Why is the rapidly decreasing the prices? Could you explain that one? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Hi, Brian Van Aerle. 2 points. One, a suggestion to Don about his, the work he's getting involved in. That is this. Probably the most important source, taking a long historical view of increases in cash incomes in African agriculture, has been the introduction of new crops. Innovation in new crops. And if you look on the macro side, this has happened. Both obviously in recent years, particularly in the fruit crop area. So one interesting question to feed into your attempt to retrieve from all the historical data will be what evidence can you piece together about how this happened and where it's happened? In your own particular sample, it seems as though the crop pattern has been somewhat stagnant, I've been talking about. But anyway, I asked you that question. In relation to Andrew's piece, it doesn't really affect his research, but it's an issue of context in which he's doing the research. There's implicit in some of your argument that mechanization will initiate agriculture change, and therefore, and this is a very common view actually amongst policymakers and leaders. I mean, if I were to, I said once, if I were given $100 for every time I'd heard people bemoaning the fact that African farmers still used hand hoes, I would be a very rich man. Huh? And you almost did it. I saw a thing going up that you didn't use. But the real issue is this. Does the use of mechanization actually typically initiate the process of agricultural change? If you look at the Green Revolution in Asia, surely not. I've actually done a fair amount of work over the years in Vietnam, including studies in the Mekong Delta. And it's clear there that the change began with new seeds, new agricultural methods, and changing the marketing system. Mechanization eventually began to happen as a consequence of this for 2 reasons. One, because the farmers got to the point where they had the capital to actually purchase machines, and secondly, because the labor market tightened. So you needed actually to have labor-saving innovations. The labor market tightened both because of the improvements in agriculture, but also because of the general structural change in Vietnam and the shift of labor into the industrial sector. So I think it's quite important not to sort of loosely suggest that mechanization is going to be the initiator of agricultural improvement. I think that's something that has to be explored with some care. Obviously, mechanization makes sense where you have spare land and you can expand the acreage. But where you in fact have a large availability of labor, it's unclear whether actual labor saving will initiate anything in terms of the community at large. Maybe the individual farmer will do better.
Okay, thank you. So, lady there. And then one more. We've got time for one more after that, so that's you. So, and then we'll take the response and then we'll wrap up. Thanks.
Hi, Nikki Banks from the University of Manchester. Thanks for 3 very interesting presentations. Dan, I have a question for you. I'm quite interested in the link between actual improvements in well-being over time against perceptions of well-being over time. So I think there's a small literature in urban areas where it shows that these don't go up simultaneously because changes aren't keeping a pace with broader developments in the area. In the village that you returned to, did you get an initial impression before you started doing the wealth ranking exercises that the village did see themselves as a very different village to the one that they were many years ago, or did that emerge in the actual exercises? And a question also for Andrew. I think you portrayed quite a convincing argument about the fact that it's better for job creation if you have machines that break down and you can have a local economy that can cope with that. And perhaps it's more my Western bias, but what's the sort of the long-term repercussions of that? I think Dan mentioned in his speech that one of presentation that one of the triggers behind the drop in wealth of the richer households could have been the breaking down of their machinery. So would you see sort of a short-term prosperous sort of effect versus a long-term kind of collapse? Is that something that you've thought about? Thank you.
And then finally, please.
Yeah, my two comments to Andrew. And you have confined the usage of particulars to cultivation, but we understand that farmers also do use this for other purposes and income generating activities, so that if this were factored in, probably it would also change or rather strengthen some of your results. But I want to come to this issue of power tillers vis-a-vis tractors. You know, the impression we're getting is that usage of or importation of tractors is not sort of a proper strategies. But also talk about these small sizes of farms, which therefore may not be very prone to usage of tractors. And I think the point that Brad's also saying. But what we're finding now, and in the project that I'm working on sunflower, is that there is a move to require or rather request the farmers to regroup themselves so that they reorganize their land and have a block where farm services, tractor farm services can be available to them and cultivate, you know, a larger plot maybe at a much more, I think, efficient or reduced prices. So is in that proper as well. But finally, I know your work goes beyond particulars. What we are experiencing is that, yes, it's true, when it comes to importation of new tractors or particulars, we're going for China and the Asian kind. But we are still observing importation of second-hand tractors from the West. So I don't know. You may wish to comment if you want, but you don't have because your presentation was confined to particulars. But I think that's also a very interesting development. Thank you.
Okay, so let me take it in reverse order. Do you have any final comments you'd like to make, Camilla and Katharine?
Yes, no? Well, I guess we'd like to perhaps just finish with a response to what you asked us earlier about whether EU policies are directly transferable. To some extent, yes. I mean, to some extent, the policies are in a position where they allow for some flexibility within there. They're very general about waste management. They're not necessarily specific about certain areas. The only query I have about that is the fact that those policies were introduced when the infrastructure was already substantially better. And the policies around recycling and redevelopment came alongside the growth and industrialisation. It wasn't almost like a retrofit as it would be in Dar es Salaam. So my question, I guess, I'm on the fence about whether you could directly transfer them, because I think there are other priorities which would take, and actually when you look across the implementation across Europe, there are other priorities in places where the infrastructure is less developed, which mean that the extent to which the policies actually have making a big impact it varies across the EU. So if that is quite likely to be the case in sub-Saharan Africa in general, I think that's what.
Thank you very much. Andrew.
Of the 44 million, of the 44 million hectares of arable land in Tanzania, only 25% is cultivated annually. Okay. Number two, I have taken for granted that mechanization could perhaps improve agriculture. But my main point is that whether it can or not, the farmers are making a choice between emerging economy machines and matured economy machines. So what should the choice be? Then, so about the land, I may be wrong, but some of the readings say so. And the third point I would like to make is that Tanzania is food sufficient. In years when there are problems, then you realize that what they have produced have been sent to Kenya or Sudan or maybe even Somalia. So there exists a demand for what Tanzania produces. And so if it can expand its output, possibly they can get foreign exchange from the sub-region. And the third point is that for one of the villages I visited, anecdotal evidence suggests that around 2005, during the rice cultivation season, if you go there around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there will be nobody in the house. They will stay on the field and come back home around 8. With the introduction of the power tillers, 4 p.m., people are back home preparing their food. So it may not improve agriculture to the extent that we expect, but will also free the labor to have some time on their own. So those are some of the reasons why I think that should increase. Then whether the continual breakdown, etc. People are not staying with the Chinese machines forever. And the Chinese machines also have grades. So in future, if you have bought an AMEC and you've made some money, they have also introduced what they call the AMEC JD, which is an improvement. So if in the first year, second year, I have an AMEC and I use it and get money, I can get an improved one. So the argument we are making is that it provides an entry point. Otherwise, people will stay out of the machinery use forever. So let's take it as a first step. Use this fragile machine, get some capital, and if you so wish, you move on. Finally, the second-hand machines, Europe is also changing. Now, Russia is opening up a lot of land for cultivation. So most of the machines we used to leave Cambridge to Africa, now the Russians buy it. So that sector is also closing up. And if you remember, in the 80s and early 90s, banks in Tanzania were providing loans for people to buy second-hand machines. But with the introduction of the Indian machines, they no longer give those loans because the machines do not have warranty. So the future of the second-hand trade is also not, we don't know what is going to happen. And today I didn't make it clear, but I'm not attempting to compare power tillers and tractors. This is just one of 5 operating conditions which I have compared. So this is for small-scale rice farmers. I also have people who are cultivating tobacco, sugarcane, who are using tractors, and I compare them from across the places I mentioned. Thank you.
Dan.
I'll need to get the magic machine up again, please. Thank you for all these questions. With respect to the detail of the slides, the question was, why am I highlighting potatoes and maize simply for illustrative value? They've got the highest and lowest increases there, respectively. This also actually is a good point to mention, to take on Brian's point, because I think you said, Brian, that the crop innovation is important. There's not very much crop innovation shown in this slide, just in the headings, but if we looked at the productivity of each of these crops, I think you'd find that potatoes and sunflowers, possibly even wheat as a smallholder crop, has increased quite dramatically in the area. So there has actually been, while all these crops were present early on, their relative abundance has changed, and so I think you're quite right, and that will be something to explore. Then going back to the question of what happened in the early 1980s to crop price, to the value of maize, I have absolutely no idea. What I was learning from David just yesterday is that the first thing that you have to think about with respect to maize price data in the early 1980s is that it's probably wrong. Despite this machine and despite all the data points that we have at that time.
You're probably right.
Oh,
But the thing about the 1980s was that during the 1980s and the period before the reforms, the official price of maize was declared by the National Milling Corporation, and all the formal channels for maize were through the National Milling Corporation. Now, what also happened was within regions there was a free market, but people were not allowed to move maize from one region to another one. And so what you had was a situation where you've got a free market price, which could vary from one region to another, and you could have the fixed price defined by the National Milling Corporation that only really applied to those people who could get their hands on things at the official price. So I would imagine that what we've got there is the unofficial price.
Well, I've got...
Which could have been higher than, if you like, could have been relatively high, because what you've got is a market where some people are able to get their maize at the official price, at a low price, but if you like, the rest of the market is settled in an informal market, and would probably at much higher prices.
Yeah, we need to move towards it wrapping up.
But so the answer is talk to David. He will know. I mean, he understands these. I'm simply putting this up mainly because of what's going on in the 1990s, 2000s, which suggests that there has been a decline. Did people? Where did the idea that people have got wealthier come from? It emerged from the data. As I was going, we started off first of all by going house to house. Before we did the participatory wealth ranking for the whole villages. And as I went to house and realised that people had got wealthier and wealthier, and the reasons for that came out in the oral histories. And unusually, because normally people look back with rose-tinted spectacles and find themselves to be poorer than they were in the past, the recognition that there had been less alcoholism, for example, came out as well in the focus groups that we did and the village public meeting. I think I've covered all but I did have one comment for Andrew, if I may. And it's a story that Robert Chambers tells about the difference between what's good for GDP and what's good for well-being. And he describes an account of an elderly lecturer like himself, who, if he spent the evening eating a meal of homegrown vegetables from his allotment, drinks a glass of water, his wife and he make love that evening, his well-being and her well-being is fantastic, but their contribution to the GDP is minimal. His colleague, who's a bit of a rogue, spends a night at the casino, drinks away half his fortune, gambles away the rest, spends money in all sorts of inappropriate ways, crashes his car on the way home, ends up in hospital, and makes an enormous contribution to GDP in the process. But his personal well-being is limited. Now, I mention this because it has bearings, I think, on your argument about the value of tractors which are breaking down every half hour. And I think there's a slippage between looking at poverty at the household level and looking at the more regional level effects. I'm not an economist, but I think you might say that there's a tax on household well-being, which then leads on to multiplier effects. But there's a slippage in the argument that you're with respect to the poverty aspects.
Yeah, which is very well. Let's not. I'm afraid not to respond to that. Okay. Because we are running out of time. I think. Yes. Let me just thank the panel for a moment and also say that essentially that was the point I was making earlier today, that you told much more charmingly in relation to this. So thanks to the panellists. I think it was an excellent set of presentations and a very good discussion afterwards. So thank you very much. And so with that, as